Just inside our opening range.
30.
Come on. Nice. Yeah, we're just gonna defend here. I think that this hand, it might do that a little bit, but not very much, just because it's tough to play versus 4-bets, and it's very easy to keep his range wider, as well as play post-flop 200 big blinds deep with a hand that wants to make the nuts, because getting 4-bet isn't really the greatest prospect with a hand like this, especially out of position. It just gets pretty tough.
So Johnnie opens it up in the cutoff 3x with queen 9 off, and this combo is actually right below the cutoff point for this default 200 big blind sim. However, this sim assumes 1 big blind max rake, and they're playing in a no rake environment, so opening this is probably fine, and we're going to add a 25% frequency for these stronger 9x offsuit combos. Landon then calls, indicating that he could 3-bet as well, and we see that to be consistent with this default sim, which mixes calling and 3-betting with most suited aces.
I'm just checking my entire range here.
Pretty decent flop for our exact hand. Good flop for our range too. I like holding the queen of hearts here. Gonna lean towards checking this one and perhaps giving Landon a chance to catch something on the turn, and perhaps bet on the turn, but we'll definitely be calling a bet on the turn and not too worried about the turn card since we do hold the queen of hearts. So we're gonna go ahead and check back and see a turn.
The flop is king, queen 7 with 2 hearts, and Landon checks, indicating he's checking range here, which we see as consistent with the solver strategy, and then Johnnie decides to check back. As we can see, the cutoff should have a pretty strong nut advantage on this board, since only he should have the overpairs and top and middle sets. However, the big blind does have some strong hands and a lot of overall connectivity to this board as well, with numerous flush and straight draws. So some checking by the cutoff is warranted, and we see that second pair is one of the best candidates to check with. These combos don't really want to bloat the pot, and Johnnie's specific hand doesn't need a ton of protection, since one of the 2 overcards is already on the board, and he's blocking some straight and flush draws. And so we see that although second pair does do a significant amount of betting, the EV regret of just checking this entire class is quite low. Johnnie could definitely fire a c-bet here, particularly with the backup equity provided by the backdoor flush draw, but checking is fine as well.
Okay, when he checks back the flop, his range is going to look a lot like smaller pairs in the board, as well as some hands that have some showdown value but don't really feel the need to bet. And hands like that would probably contain a 7 in them. Our hand here is obviously one drawing to a very strong hand, and blocking ace-king doesn't really matter when most of the time it's going to be betting the flop. I think on this turn, I am going to have a lot of bluffs that are going to want to bet a very large size to maximize fold equity. And this hand's kind of cool because you can't really go wrong. Just because we're drawing to an overcard, we're drawing to the nut flush, we are really deep behind, that we are trying to get some money into the pot here. That you can kind of do a bunch of different things in betting small, betting pretty big, checking to check raise is a bluff of sorts to where you're drawing to obviously a very strong hand and getting more money and facing a bet. But I think in this case, I kind of want to just use my entire, I'm just going to leverage kind of my image in a little bit. Just by I'm going to have hands like Jack 10 with a heart. I'm going to have 6-5 suited. I'm going to have hands with other gutters and a heart. So here, I got drawing to the nuts. I'm going to go for an overbet. There's about 65 in the pot. So I'm going to bet pretty big here. I'm going to go 2x pot. So 120. And I would do this with sets, 2 pairs, and vulnerable hands.
120.
So Landon nearly 2x's the pot with his nut flush draw, and the solver does in fact really like this bet, firing it with nearly 80% frequency. So why is this? Well, the first thing Landon does is he analyzes Johnnie's check-back range, rightly identifying the fact that it should be largely comprised of underpair/showdown type of hands. If we go back to the flop, we see that on this board, which was favorable to the in-position player, nearly all of Johnnie's strongest hands are firing, and the combos that are checked with highest frequency are these mid-strength hands. In contrast, on the flop, the big blind was checking 100% of its range, including its strongest hands. So when the turn was a brick, the state of the ranges at the end of the flop remained largely in place at the start of the turn. Johnnie's range remains largely capped, while Landon's range is uncapped. Right, if we isolate combos with at least 90% equity that are in the range at least 10% of the time, we see that Landon has many more hands in this category compared to Johnnie. He has a higher percentage of both sets and two pairs given the action. So based on this dynamic, Landon aptly recognizes that he should have a number of combos that want to begin building the pot, and fast, since there's only one streak to come and the SPR is high. Right, on a flop that is advantageous to the in-position player, one of the reasons why the out-of-position player is often content to check even its strongest hands is because on such a board, the in-position player should have a very high incentive to bet a large portion of his range, which the out-of-position player can then respond to with a check raise or simply a call to allow the in-position player to continue to build the pot. However, when the in-position player declines to bet, especially when deeper stacked, the out-of-position player's strong hands now have urgency to make up for the missed streak of betting. And this dynamic also provides cover for the big blind's bluffs, which Landon recognizes will also want to bet big to leverage max fold equity. Since Johnnie's range is largely comprised of mid-strength hands, a smaller bluff would likely face a higher percentage of calls. So ultimately, a decent portion of Landon's range should have a strong incentive to pro-bet large on this specific blank card. Right, if we take a look at the big blind strategy across all possible turn cards, we see that the turn cards the big blind will bet most often with this large sizing are these total bricks, which fail to uncap the cutoff's range. In contrast, the solver bets this sizing least often on turn cards that improve a significant portion of the cutoff's check-back range, including diamond combos that bring in another flush draw, hearts which bring in flushes and additional flush draws, and 9x, jack-x, and 10x combos which bring in additional sets, two pairs, and straights, right in the vicinity of the cutoff's check-back range. So now that we know that Landon should be doing a significant amount of overbetting here, how should his range be constructed? Well, let's isolate the big blind's hands that are using this sizing with a greater than 50% frequency to find out. First, let's take a look at the big blind's value combos that are predominantly using this sizing. Not surprisingly, we see sets, two pairs, and the strongest top pairs. When we filter for combos in the next tier down, we see that there are no combos with 50 to 75% equity that are betting this sizing with greater than 50% frequency, which makes sense since this overbet is very polarizing, and so by definition, the big blind's range should not contain a significant proportion of mid-strength hands. When we examine the next tier down, we see that the solver is firing this overbet with a number of nut flush draws, combo draws, and interestingly with 3 deuce suited as well, which seems to be a sort of merged protection bet / bluff, which also gives the big blind a strong river bluffing candidate. And finally, Landon's weakest combos utilizing this sizing consist of lower flush draws and gut shots with 1 heart.
Wow, it's almost as if he could hear me on the flop. This is a very peculiar sizing. He obviously knows that I have some sort of hand that has showdown value on the flop and I'm checking back. This would definitely be some kind of a hero fold here. What would he use this sizing with? I guess he probably has some sort of equity to use the sizing. Could definitely have ace high hearts. He could have a 2-pair hand like king 3 of spades, something like that. I just don't know why he would use this sizing when it's clear that I don't have a super high value hand, because I capped myself by checking back the turn on a 2 heart board. Pretty dynamic board to check back, so I'm just gonna hero call this one and perhaps hero call the turn too. Obviously now I don't love having the queen of hearts, but we're gonna call and see what happens on the turn. Unfortunately, the problem is that I'm capped here and he knows that I'm capped, so he could be using that to his advantage.
So Johnnie calls, and we see that second pair is right at the cutoff point of calling and folding, which warrants the back and forth deliberation that Johnnie engaged in. All top pair plus and stronger draws are calling, but his hand is right near the borderline, which is exactly why this sizing is so effective. Johnnie recognizes the fact that he's capped and that Landon knows he's capped and is using that to his advantage. So when the solver takes this flop check back line, to avoid being exploited, it is forced to shift into bluff catching mode. As Johnnie correctly points out, Landon should have a number of decent equity bluffs that Johnnie is ahead of, and he even calls out Landon's ace-high hearts hand as one of the primary bluffing candidates. So this dynamic causes the solver to bluff catch with most of its queen-x combos. Virtually 100% of its ace-queen combos are calling, and then the remainder of calls are mixed among the queen-x combos largely based on their unblocking properties. Right, if we exclude ace-queen, we see that the combos with the lowest unblocker scores are basically pure folds, as the jack and 10 of hearts block a number of the big blind's most common bluffs. In contrast, when we take a look at the cutoff's queen-x combos with the highest unblocker scores, we see that most of these combos are calling, and the EV regret for calling all of them is 0, even though they have a weaker kicker.
Well, that's the right color, wrong shape. So in a spot like this with ace high, we have a lot worse hands who want to bluff in our overall range. This is kind of one of those hands where when we do choose this size, we're going to try to use it to polarize, and obviously rep what we have, which would be the nut flush if that was the jack of hearts. So in this spot we have a pretty easy check and then fold to a bet, and I'm going to have a lot lower valued showdown hands that I'm going to want to bluff on this river. And most of them would want to contain a 10 in them just because you block both straights, and you probably don't want the 10 of hearts because we want him to be drawing with a hand like ace 10 with the 10 of hearts when he calls a 2x pot bet on the turn. So we're just going to check here and wave the white flag. We did our best. We tried to hit big and we didn't do it, so we're just going to check here.
The river is the jack of diamonds, and Landon waves the white flag. He articulates that ace-high is a particularly bad combo to bluff with, and this is consistent with the solver strategy, where we see that most ace-highs are in fact checking, and the EV regret for just pure checking this entire class is quite low. In fact, Landon's hand in particular is one of the worst bluffing combos in his entire range, as it is, by far, blocking the greatest proportion of Johnnie's weaker combos. Right, the ace of hearts blocks the nut flush draws in the cutoff's range, and the 8 of hearts blocks a number of other flush draws, as well as the few pocket 8s that remained in Johnnie's range, but would likely fold to a further bet. Landon also alludes to the fact that he has other better bluffing candidates in his range, specifically identifying combos with a 10 that block both the ace 10 and 9-10 straights. And when we isolate the big blind's weakest combos and filter for the hands with a 10, we see that these hands are in fact shoving nearly 80% of the time with an EV regret of only 0.1% of the pot. In fact, even pocket 10s are shoving here despite having showdown value due to their very heavy blocking properties.
More than happy to check this one back and just hope that he gave up with hearts, or he may have gotten showdown value with a hand like jack 10, so which we can beat but not necessarily squeeze value out of after his turn sizing. So let's check this one.
And Johnnie breathes a sigh of relief with an easy check back. As we can see, the thinnest value bet in this spot is top pair with either top kicker or a straight blocker. So ultimately both guys play their hands pretty much perfectly according to GTO. Johnnie used his hand as a bluff catcher and won max value with just second pair, and although Landon lost, perhaps he can find some solace in the fact that he achieved a clean sheet and did a superb job of recognizing what his range wanted to do on each street and where his specific combo fit within that range. So that is the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay bounced.